Samantha, and I'll be your host today. And a huge thank you again to Suffolk University's Sawyer Business School for hosting this conference. As you may have noticed arriving, this downtown location is the perfect hub for exploring Boston's innovation ecosystem and learning from industry leaders. The goal behind Startup Boston Week is to connect the entire greater Boston and New England startup community, all industries, all startup departments, and all bootstrapped and funding stages for 5 days of learning and connecting with one another. The team that creates Startup Boston Week is primarily volunteer-led, and the folks working the conference today are all volunteering their time as well. So thank you for attending. This conference is a labor of love, and we appreciate you playing a role in shaping our startup community. Thank you so much again for attending, and on to the session. Take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Okay, my name's Igor. I'll be the moderator today, and if Max doesn't show up in the next minute or two, I'll argue one half of this. But I run a company called Fast CTO. We help startups in like a nonprofit way, connecting them to CTOs and developers. But just for context, and I'm sure Jane has a very similar story, I've both hired contractors, hundreds of them, and I've led in-house teams, hundreds of them, with hundreds of developers. So easy to argue either side. And then here is Jane.
Hi there. So I'm Jane Allard. I've been kind of working in the software industry for a long time. I worked at both MathWorks and Akamai in tools teams. So at that time, mostly hiring in-house, building in-house to support the developers to make things efficient, fast, make it easy to do their jobs. And then I joined the startup world. I was CTO at a large data startup, hired a lot of contractors, also had some in-house help. And now I'm at GSK, also building a large data platform for a new initiative, GSK, called Onyx, which we're trying to bring together all of the research data we have available for the research scientists to enable faster drug discovery. Kind of like as Igor said, I have hired many, many engineers over the year, both in-house contractors for a lot of projects. So I'm excited to argue today for the in-house. You should build in-house. That's what I'm arguing.
Beautiful. Yeah, and so as a heads up, I think the overall kind of story today is that we're going to lie to you for 45 minutes because the answer is it depends. And it depends on every situation. And so what I want to do is make this a little interactive. I have a bunch of questions for Jane. We'll argue. But if you have a unique use case, you're like, well, for my use case, should I hire or should I outsource? Raise your hand, we'll bring you in, and we'll figure it out. All right, I have a couple of questions here specifically picked out beforehand, but let's start this off. So the topic is, building an in-house tech stack is more cost-effective in the long term compared to outsourcing development efforts. Jane, take it away.
Sure. So absolutely, I believe that is more effective in the long term. What makes something easy to maintain, what makes it cost effective, is that you've actually made it maintainable, and you've made it easy, and you reduce the complexity in what you're building. And if you are working with outsource, you don't really have a lot of control over their decisions always, unless you're really in the weeds. You don't know maybe what tech stacks they're using, you don't know how they're deploying it. Like I spent a lot of time in the DevOps space and deployment. That's actually where it gets hard, how you maintain it over time. You're relying on other things that could change beneath you. And if you have somebody else doing that, or you have some kind of hybrid system, it gets really hard and complicated to maintain. So if you want to have something that you have control over, that you know how it's working, you can put the right resources on it, and only what you need as you're building it, I think it's way more effective to do it in-house.
But is it cost effective?
Oh, cost effective, yes.
Okay. So on the other side, what I've noticed a couple of times is in-house teams tend to get a little bit stagnant. In the sense that you've got a developer, they're working for a couple of years, they're not necessarily spending a lot of time outside of work keeping up with the latest stuff, and so you accelerate technologically a little slower than if, let's say, you were working with an outsourcing team where there's always that drive to keep up to, there's competition kind of, right? And so if you've got a team, there's Max. You could take over. You might disagree with my argument here.
100%.
We're halfway through the first one. He's doing contracts right now.
Yeah. So we're talking about whether building an in-house tech stack is more cost effective in the long term. Jane just said how it is more cost effective to hire in-house? And Max, if you could tell us why it is not, because my argument was a little weak.
That's all right. I mean, I think we're at Startup Week, right? And startups have this long-term view of the world, but they need to live in short chunks. So your short-term really matters from a cash flow point of view, from skills development point of view. You might have a team that doesn't have the skills that you need, and hiring for those skills might be really hard. And so it could be very costly if you try to hire in-house early, and then you have to let go of those teams because you got the wrong people. While if you had a third-party outsourcing firm that specializes on, I don't know, say Web3 development, or maybe it's a specific AI thing that you're trying to implement, you don't have the skills in-house. Imagine how much time and effort you can save by learning from that and then bridging that towards a long-term goal. So that's my take on how you think about, that savings on short-term versus long-term. Depends on how you define them.
So are you saying, Max, that you would bring in specialized experts on a contract basis in an environment like AI or Web3 or whatever, but then convert that to in-house knowledge? Is that like your optimal plan?
Yeah, most likely. I do. I mean, obviously, if technology is core, you want to develop that core expertise in-house. The question is, when do you do it, and when is the investment right? To me, like, it doesn't always make sense to invest early on to build that long-term view, because again, you might be living in these short snippets of your world, which is, I need to get to my next fundraising, I need to launch my prototype, I need to fill in the blank, and I think that's where outsourcing might help you get there, and then you learn from that and bridge towards that long-term goal.
Fair enough. Jane, any...
Second, my rebuttal.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we're looking at costs over the long term. The cost to bring in those experts, if you are going after talent that is scarce, it's expensive kind of no matter what you do. So it might not always be cost effective even in the short term versus long term if you can transfer that knowledge. If you're at a startup, you don't necessarily know what you're going to be doing. So I think it's better to try to hire in-house people who are very curious, who like to learn, who can learn quickly, and then they can adapt as they go, as opposed to trying to always find the scarce, expensive talent, especially if it's in a hard to find field.
Okay. Oh, yeah. I will take questions as long as I like the questions.
You're a beautiful man. Can you just weigh in on, so Max, what you said makes sense about just thinking short term?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Max, your answer makes sense on the short term, just based on the funding and the runway of funds. Can you guys weigh in on, have you added in like offshore resources to further minimize that cost, and then how that translated to like back to your internal teams, and has that been beneficial or not?
Yeah. Let me tee that up a little bit differently. Let's take a tangent and define what we mean by outsourcing, because there's different flavors of outsourcing. Yeah, but there are, and so some of the arguments might be a little different depending on the flavor of outsourcing. So, Max, since you're arguing for outsourcing, give us the flavors that there are.
Yeah, so the way I see it, outsourcing, you've got different flavors, like Igor is saying. First, you've got the agency. An agency basically comes in with everything you need, soup to nuts. Like, you need a designer to help you, visualize what is it that you're building. You need a product manager, project manager to figure out what are the tasks, how do you break this down into stories, maybe do a little bit of feedback loops with your customers. And you need a team to do everything from set up servers, infrastructure, all the way through to back-end, front-end, and everything else that is going to be a delivered product. Here's like your finished product. That's one type of agency. There's outsourcing, where you might actually have specific resources. I need to hire 3 senior engineers that are front-end focused with React and Elixir or whatever you may have. Then on all of that, you also have the third flavor of outsourcing, which is staff augmentation. Basically, I'm going to pay somebody to put people on my team. They're going to work full-time for me as if they were part of my team, but they're still managed, and they're their employees, not mine. All of that can be nearshore. It can be in the US. It can be outsourced offshore. Then there's the kind of like new thing that has emerged, which is my company Telescope. I don't know if I did the intro, but basically we focus on getting remote engineers to connect with you as a company, and then you hire them full-time through an intermediary that becomes your employer of record. But that's just somebody who's doing like the legal figure of making sure you can hire them compliantly, but technically they're your employees. They're just remote somewhere else outside of the US. So I think those are the main flavors I've seen. I don't know if I missed
And I would
any.
put that last one in the in-house category.
Right, you're building your team in-house, but through a third party that helps you find and hire those people, but they are your team. Effectively, that's in-house.
Yeah, in terms on the in-house argument, like that, I think that last one, if you do want to try to get talent outside of, say, the US, like I think that's your best way to find someone who's going to be incentivized to work on your team. And this is where it's tough, like the debate versus what's in-house versus you ask for real experience. If you don't have what you were just talking about, if you don't have someone who's going to run the product, who's going to be able to organize the team, you don't have an architect, and you're hiring a group that's doing that all for you, that generally is not very cheap. Like if you're trying to hire a team that's essentially replacing all of those roles, but it also means you're kind of stuck with them. And if they're not high quality, if it doesn't work, you just spend a lot of money on something that didn't work out. I think it's better to have a bit of a hybrid. We have some of that skill, and you're able to guide if you're working with other teams, particularly what you were just talking about last one, then they're kind of on your team. If you can find a good, now for like the advice part, even when you're going to go try to hire contractors, you got to find like a trusted vendor, or if you're going to work with a third party. Sounds like you might be a good one for people to work with. If you don't, you're not going to get high quality. It might have been better not to do anything then, because now you have this bunch of code that doesn't work and you spend a lot of money on it. So it's not always faster because you have to vet. If you don't have a previously vetted partner, you then have to spend time vetting that partner. And that's where I've seen it go great. Like if you find a great partner, you really can get some great kind of offshore and nearshore talent. But if you don't have a vetted partner, you don't find like the right fit, it's almost worse than if you did nothing.
Yeah. One last point there, maybe that it's important. Back to, is this thing your core or not? Let's say that you're a hardware company. Start building like this crazy device. We have this better transistor, but we need some software for the user to, interact with it. Software is ancillary. It's not my core. I might get a team because I don't want to build that expertise. So it depends on, are you investing in this for the long haul, or is this something you need to get up and running quickly? Maybe not cheaply, it depends, right? It could be lower cost if you find a good partner abroad, but it doesn't have to always be because of the cost. So those are, I think, are use cases.
All right, awesome. I like it. Can you guys hear me? I think over here worse, over here better. Whoa, over here definitely better. Okay, perfect. All right, next question. The risks associated with outsourcing development are greater than those of in-house development. And I'll start with Max this time.
Yeah, okay, well, I'm going to make the same argument I did earlier, right? You hire somebody, it takes you 2 months to build a pipeline because you don't have an HR team, you're a small startup. You've interviewed, I don't know, 10, 20, 50 people. That's a lot of hours from you, the founder, from this, the engineering, head of engineering, your frontline developers. You're spending all this time. You think you got the right person, and then 2 months into the job, you realize, you know what, they were the wrong person. Now you spend how many dollars, how many hours, and time is precious. You've got 8 months of runway, and now you spend 3 of those 8 months finding that engineer. That can be really risky for a startup, particularly if you don't know how to evaluate, if you don't have a strong set of experience in-house with building the pipeline, interviewing, identifying the right people from both the skills but also a culture point of view. It takes some cycles for you to get up that learning curve. So I would say there's a lot of risk in that.
So I'm going to talk about a different kind of risk. So you see, I'm in governance. So I'm going to talk about security risks of in-house versus contractors. So if you have systems, you have to onboard people, you have to onboard your full-time, you have to onboard your contractors. Often you give different kinds of access. So you have to figure out what you want across all of your services, like where you host your code, like how you're tracking issues. Are you in the cloud somewhere? Even like your Slack systems, like I've seen it where contractors only get this very limited amount of exposure, but then you have to manage that. So every time you have to manage something differently, particularly in onboarding and offboarding, there's a risk there because you're doing it probably by hand if you're a startup. You could do it wrong. Now you've just exposed your whole financials to some contractor in an offshore location. So I think there's actually much greater security risk when you have contractors as opposed to having people in-house, in which you generally, through the fact that you have vetted them and hired them, it's less likely you're gonna let them have access to your entire system. So just different kind of risk than when you say.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think with compliance, great point, but if you're a startup that requires heavy compliance from the get-go, you're gonna have to invest in it regardless whether that's for your team or somebody else. And I would actually argue that if you're in a compliant, heavy environment, whether that's SOC 2, HIPAA, whatever you may need to be compliant with, you can actually find a partner that's already SOC 2 compliant, HIPAA compliant, and you can have some of those best practices be transferred over to your team who, again, early young startup might have never done it, right? So there's also advantages if you see it on the kind of from an opposite side of the table.
I mean, never about that. It's like, in this world, I think even if you're not compliant heavy, you have to worry about security. There's just so much more risk and exposure now than there used to be.
Yeah.
And we all just got a big, even if you're just how you're deploying, got a big taste of that with CrowdStrike.
We can agree on that,
Yeah,
100%.
No, you're not allowed to agree with her.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
I
I have to
know.
agree.
I want to agree with you on some stuff too. I'll agree at the end. I'll be like, here's all the things I actually agreed with them on.
All right, so you guys mentioned time risks, money risks, and security risks. Are there any other kinds of risks that you want to argue about? Or I can move on to the next question.
I feel like there's a similar risk what I had raised in the last questions. Like it's a risk of any time you bring in talent. You just don't know if it's going to work out. And then there's some risk with you hire somebody in-house, it's harder to let them go. Contractor hopefully is easier to let go. But what has happened in the meantime? Like what mistakes do you have to clean up? Like what was your risk exposure? And then with a contractor, I think it's more likely you'd be exposed to that because you do less vetting. That's my rebuttal.
Yeah, well, I think with contractors, you can scale up and down. You know, like, hey, we got the wrong mix of the team. We got 3 front ends and 1 back end. It is actually the opposite. It should have been 3 and 1 front end. You can just make that change overnight because that's the job of like this capacity planning with an agency that has fully staffed teams that you can, have them ebb and flow as you need. And then on the other side, if you do hire somebody, it's not just that it didn't work out because you got the wrong person. What if you got the right person, but flashy new startup just raised $50 million next door, and they just leave? Like people, there's attrition. It's real. While an outsourcing firm, you'll have some support in terms of like backfilling those transitions.
Cool. Any questions from the audience before I move on to the next one?
I did have another rebuttal on that.
Oh, okay.
Those firms that have that talent, they're not necessarily cheap. So
At all, yeah.
so it's not necessarily a better, it might be a time trade-off. You could get faster time to market, but it's not necessarily a cost trade-off.
Yeah.
So know what you're going for. If you're going for cost or time, like there's different decisions you might make. Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
I wanted to ask a little bit or introduce the idea that onboarding.
I want to introduce the idea that onboarding new staff is very timely, and so there's a little bit of a fantasy if you are outsourcing that you can just swap somebody in new. And very often with outsourcing agencies, you don't have a lot of control over their hiring practices and their retention practices. So you might be at the short end of the stick, and they tell you the person you've worked with and built rapport with and got them onboarded into your system is no longer with the organization, and you're back to square one. So how do you kind of justify that and say this is okay and it's better than onboarding internally?
Yeah, great points. I think the first thing is when you do choose your partner in outsourcing, you got to make sure that you ask those questions, right? What is normal attrition? What happens when somebody, decides to take another job? How much time do we have here to make that transition happen? But the thing is, they are experienced in having that problem, right? While as a startup, you probably are not. Like, you're not set up to have everything fully documented as well as you should. Maybe you should, but you're not. And then these outsourcing firms, they do have systems where they might have more middle management, where a startup, you can't afford it, you don't have it. So they have this knowledge transfer, which can be a little more seamless. It's still going to be painful, I'm not going to lie. But it might be a little easier than if it happens for you in-house. And the fact that it's immediate when you get the replacement versus having to go build a pipeline, start interviewing, put out an offer, get it declined, put out another offer, get it accepted, 2 weeks notice or maybe a month's notice, depending on where they work. It's 3 months of delay, and that's very costly in time in startup years.
Yeah, I mean, onboarding, whether it's full-time or contractors, takes time and is work. And if you don't have good processes or documentation, it's going to be slow in either case. So in some ways, like we said, it's a bit of a fantasy thing, just swap in and out. But can you reduce any of that onboarding time? And a lot of it has to do with what you've set up before. And if you haven't vetted that the contract agency or the contractor, or if it's like a one-off contractor that they are obligated to write some documentation or do some kind of handoff, then it's going to be a very challenging handoff. But if you're not doing that in-house, when you hire someone new, it's also going to be challenging when you onboard. So it's like, how much do you want to invest in documenting what's there, and which is challenging in a startup because you might actually end up throwing it away. So it's like finding that balance of how you try to reduce time for onboarding.
Awesome. Yeah, you guys set a high bar for good questions, just for everyone else. Okay. Next question. Building technology in-house is better for aligning with long-term strategic goals compared to outsourcing development. And I guess, Jane, you could start this one.
So why I feel strongly about this one, even outside of the debate, is we want to align the incentives. If you have someone at your startup, it's hopefully full-time because they believe in your mission and what you're doing, and they're probably compensated in some way with equity, and they're really invested in trying to make the right thing, and they're trying to do it efficiently and effectively. If you're hiring somebody to work as a contractor, their incentive is to get hours. So they're not always incentivized to do things as cost effective as possible or to do something as limited as possible. So that's one reason I think it's better. Another is the bought into the mission. So when you're trying to make decisions about what direction you go in a product, or if you're bringing your customers in, if someone's in-house, hopefully they're bought into your mission, you can trust their judgment on decisions. If you're hiring a contractor, they might not be able to make those judgment calls without you. So you might have to be more involved, and they might be more time consuming you because you might have to review all the decisions to ensure that it's aligning with your strategy. So those are my 2 things.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, I'm sorry to keep repeating the same thing, but it's like your long-term strategy is a mirage, right? IPO, okay, what does that mean? Well, I need to make it to my next milestone. And so I think thinking in those stretches changes the way that you approach the problem. Imagine that you could find a partner in an outsourcing firm. The first thing is align the incentives from the get-go, right? This is not a 3-week project. This is, you're gonna be my partner throughout the life cycle of my company, and I want you to be there to help me maintain my systems, build them for them to be scalable, and make sure that we're putting the right blocks in place so that we can go from the V1 to V2 to V3, because this is our vision. You can have them be bought into the mission. I mean, these people are working very closely with you many times, either through staff augmentation or as a team that is deploying or delivering something full. They can still be very much bought into your mission. It's your job to make sure that you align those incentives, that you have those conversations. And then the last thing is you actually get access to resources that you probably cannot afford. So if you're super early stage startup, you cannot get a very senior experienced person to come in and do your architecture because it's your CTO who happened to be your roommate in college and they've got 2 years of experience. They don't have 20, right? What if you could access those things as part of that outsourcing team? Because that's what that outsourcing firm can offer. So there's that long-term alignment that you can get from the right partner, but I emphasize the right partner. You gotta make sure that you choose the right person, the right company, and the right team, and then align those incentives for the long haul.
So my rebuttal on that is finding the time for that right partner and setting up that contract could probably sometimes take longer than hiring somebody. So it's just like, what's your strategy on what you would go forward with?
So, hi, my name is Chander. My question is a follow-up to this topic we're just discussing right now. So, what are the common pitfalls and good questions to ask when you're interviewing some of these outsourcing companies for, your projects?
What a good question. Great ask. So what I would ask is, first of all, referral customers. I don't want to just hear what they're saying. I want to hear, give me 3 companies that look like me in my industry that went from where I am to where I want to go, and I want to talk with them. So referrals is number 1. The second is what we were talking about. How do they deal with the managing of transitions in the team? How do we staff the team? If I need to have 10 people tomorrow, is that feasible, or is it going to take you 3 weeks to get those people? The other thing is what happens once you hand me something if there's a disagreement? How are those change orders, as they would be called, managed? And also, these companies love it when you're thinking long-term because that means you're going to have a high lifetime value for them, but then making sure that upfront you understand, so if there's going to be a maintenance fee or a service fee, what does that look like and how does it align with my reality as a startup? So making sure that it's just alignment of incentives. It's identifying the right partner, and once you've thought and realized and decided this is the one I want to go with, make sure that you're aligned in the way that you're evaluating the success so that your success is tied to their success.
Thank you.
So in addition to those, something that I always look for is engineering acumen. And if you are not experienced as engineers, you might want to see if you can find a friend or someone you know who will try to ask questions. So I like to get into the nuts and bolts, how do you, what's your development processes? How are you hosting? How do you track work? Where do you deploy? Because their answers will give me a clue whether they actually know what they're doing, whether they really made production code that can last over time. So that's what, in addition to kind of what you said, you also want to make sure they can do a good job, and you have to probe a bit on some of the technical details. And if that's not your background, find someone who can help you do that so you can help ensure that they're going to be able to deliver for you.
It's a great point, and I'm going to add something else which I just thought of. You have to make sure that they have built high availability in production systems, complex systems, products, web apps, single page apps, not just websites. You're going to have probably 90% of agencies out there build websites. And most of you, if you have a company and a startup in the software world, you're not building a website, you're building a product. And so I think there's a very different mindset, and you got to make sure that you're talking to the right type of agency.
Yeah, those are all awesome. I'm going to jump in with a couple more, though. So referrals, for me, that's 90% of it. And actually, not just read testimonials, talk to the founders. How was it working with them? Look for founders that have worked with a company for many years, right? And then I don't know if I would call this chain of command or whatever, but I've seen so many situations with these outsourced developers or agencies where the founders don't have a direct communication line with the developers. They're always talking through some like PM, which for me is like a non-starter. So like ask those questions, like who am I talking to? Can I interview the developers that you're bringing onto the project? Like that kind of stuff. Okay, I think there was a question. Somebody had, yeah.
So, hi, my name is Daniel. This question specifically for Jane. So for very early stage startups that you have a problem that you're excited to solve, you still haven't found the right solution, or you're still unsure if you have product market fit. Do you think at that stage, which is very early stage, does it make more sense to, work with a partner, with a, outsourcing team while you're still figuring out if it makes sense, and then once you do find that niche, then kind of invest to develop in-house?
My kind of real advice on that is figure out what you can do without building any code to get a better idea of what you want to do, or using like things you could do yourself off the shelf, like Figmas. There's a lot you can do to try to figure out your solution before you even hire a developer. So my advice is to figure out what you could do to test out your ideas as low code as possible. I was like working with a startup, and we did a Google form to get an idea of what we could do, and anyone here can make a Google form. So like my advice is to learn as much as you can before, especially if you're not an engineer, before you hire an engineer, and then that I think will give you a better idea. If you're not technical and you don't have a lot of people in your technical network, yeah, you like really your only choice is to find contractors. But then I would get advice in kind of going what you're talking about, make sure they're well vetted, and that you have someone that you like hopefully can ask for advice on whether that's actually a good team.
Maybe to add, and I'm for outsourcing in this panel, but no outsourcing firm is going to answer the question of how do I find product market fit, right? You need to figure out like what problem you're solving and how your solution is unique and different, and that's through a lot of founder conversations with customers, faking it before you make it, trying to go, even if it's paper prototyping, whiteboarding, whatever it takes to get to a point where like now you have an idea and maybe you don't know how to translate that idea into software. Then maybe you engage a firm, but not before, because I think you're going to be spinning your wheels and wasting a lot of time and money, honestly, trying to find that, let's ground this into an idea that can actually be implemented phase.
Yeah. Too many technical founders build before they think, including myself. Right, and then you waste 6 months building something before you're like, wait, does anybody actually want it? And so if you're not technical founder, like I have the benefit of being able to waste my time, right? But if I'm not technical, then I'm paying money for someone to do this, right? And then that they're 1,000% right. Like, don't spend money until you know what you want to build.
Or even at least you know which one to test.
Yeah.
Like what's like, when I talk to people, it's like all the scientific methods, like what's the cheapest, fastest test you can do, and then do it again, and then do it again. And at that point, okay, I think maybe it's worth spending some money.
Cool. Was there another raised hand? No? Okay, good. All right, next question. All of these are kind of similar now that I'm reading them out loud. Outsourcing development is more scalable and cost efficient for handling fluctuating project demands than in-house development. So we're talking about kind of what, Max, you were talking about, demands fluctuate. I will let Jane do this one first, because I know your position.
I mean, the answer is self-explanatory.
Yeah.
It's right in the question, right?
So I tried to come up with slightly different ways to say things, like prep. So for this one, I kind of went in a different direction. Why is your demand fluctuating so much? Kind of figure out your strategy first, because whether you're onboarding and offboarding full-time or onboarding and offboarding contractors, because your demand's all over the place, or you don't know what you're doing, you're wasting money and time either way. So it kind of goes back to what we just kind of answered, like try to figure out what you're doing first so that you don't have to do that. That doesn't mean there aren't like real life situations that things happen where you have to like find other resources, but if it's happening to you all the time, you're probably not doing something right.
Okay.
Can I add something there?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I think that the idea of being able to scale up and down, there are businesses that will naturally have some seasonality, whether you're selling to the education space and it's like it's enrollment season and we need support engineers to go either sell the product or implement the product that the universities we're selling to or what have you. You might not want to take your core team of super expensive Boston-based, New York-based engineers to do this work when you can have somebody do it for 1/3 of the cost, somewhere in Latin America, somewhere in Asia. Like, it just doesn't make sense, right? So from a cost effectiveness point of view, there are certain tasks and things that happen which are not ongoing, which you might not want to hire full-time for. And so if you can identify those, that's a great use of nearshore resources.
Yeah, like on the more the advice side, if you do have the seasonality or you have known at times when your demand is variable, you would hopefully invest in processes to make that offboarding and onboarding really seamless. But if it's always like an emergency, then you're going to be, I think, in trouble.
No bueno.
Yeah.
All right, I have a surprise question for you guys.
Ooh.
All right, and I'm going to make you kind of do this backwards. So, Max, what is a type of role that you should never outsource? Not including like CEO. Well, actually, no. I'll withdraw that. What are some roles that you should never outsource?
So back to my product market fit problem, I think the role of, I don't know if I want to call it R&D, but the identifying the new thing, coming up with the new idea. It's very hard to find a firm that can effectively do this over and over and over, because it takes a certain type of DNA, maybe founder DNA, where you're experimenting, you're kind of like in the dark, but you're happy to do fast prototyping, put out like 100 different things in a month, show it to customers. It's a profile that is super hard to recruit for, by the way. If you're looking for that technical co-founder, that CTO, it's not just like somebody who's a brilliant engineer who can, she can go and code the whole thing in overnight. Okay, great. But does she have that go-to-market mindset? Is she able to talk to customers and get that feedback built back into the product? Because ultimately, that's how you win, right? Very hard to outsource that core expertise in my mind, early on.
And you know what's coming, Jane.
Yeah, so I agree, like a founder, like someone thinking about the product, someone thinking about like your vision and mission. But I was also thinking like chief architect, like if someone who's like really going to set up the foundation for what you're building and how you do it at scale, but an architecture who also can understand product a bit, so they know how the architecture aligns with your strategy. But that's also really hard to find.
But I'm gonna take Max's position for a second. For what you're describing for a chief architect, you don't need someone like that full time.
You could probably do someone fractional, but you want to make sure that they're incentivized.
And how do we define fractional? Is it fractional in-house or fractional outsourced?
What do you think? How do you define your company?
I think we're a little bit of a blend of both.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
like when I help people, I think I'm a blend as well.
Yeah.
Because I think that stuff, especially when you're new, you can do it fractionally.
I actually disagree with the fact that, I think architecture you can outsource. If you find that, it's all about finding the right partner, the partner that you trust to be doing the right thing for you for the long term, because they want that business, they want that partnership, they want to build with you, not for 3 months, not for 1 year. They want to be your partner along the way and maybe even help you recruit that full-time, architect or whoever it may be that you need. Finding that is very hard, but it's possible. I don't think it's impossible. Whereas finding an outsourcing firm to do your, I don't know, shooting in the dark, I don't know what I'm building piece, I think it's impossible. So it's like there's a line there.
I think if you're in a really innovative space where there's a lot of churn, I think it gets harder to find that architecture offset. So
That's right.
And then, Jane, what is a type of role that you should never hire in-house?
24/7 support. Like if you have to support 24/7 and you are a small team, you should.
A call center.
Yeah, you should outsource that.
I would expand that. I agree 100%, but I think it's any non-core function that you can take advantage of lower cost somewhere else. Like, why not do it? It's not core.
Awesome. Okay, any questions?
I have a question. Talking about the roles that you don't want to outsource. So let's say there's a product owner, product manager role that we decide we don't want to outsource because that person brings a lot of vision to the table. So when you do outsource the development efforts while you have an in-house product person, any tips for maintaining good dynamics between the in-house and the outsource team?
I can go first. I think the first thing that I've seen work is don't treat them as us versus them, right? We're all together building this thing. You might be paid through an outsourcing firm and doing this project on a project basis. But again, if things are aligned properly from a contractual point of view, from the get-go, we're both incented to make this thing work. And your success should be my success and vice versa. And most of the time, if you're building something interesting, they can get excited about it too, as anybody that you would bring in-house full-time. So I think getting that culture to be like, we're building this together versus, oh, let's throw this crappy thing that nobody wants to do to the outsourcing team because we can, that creates a friction that then they're not gonna be fully bought in like you want them to be. And so I think that's my take. Obviously on top of that, just standard best practices, good communication, documentation, making sure that there's clear ownership and accountability. If somebody's gonna deliver something, and they don't, what happened? Let's do a postmortem, go through all the, software development lifecycle, best practices, but that's also in-house, so it's not specific to outsourcing.
Yeah, so to add to that, like definitely, like, sort of in addition to what you're saying, like make sure they're just really hands-on, like especially at the beginning, like meeting every day, like going through even the kind of nuts and bolts of like what are the tasks if you're using like Jira, they're looking at the tickets that they're agreeing, and kind of goes through your accountability and ownership. They're agreeing on what is said, but also making sure you're doing demos. Because that will really let you see that they're delivering or not. Can they get something working in front of you? And I would even say at first, try to do them weekly. If you have like a full-time contracting team, like they should be demoing something to you weekly so that you know that they're trying to think about making something work as opposed to just like tinkering around in some code.
Yeah, this actually reminds me of one thing we didn't talk about in your question earlier. Make sure that you understand the resource sharing practices within the firm. Are they resource sharing? Like, is this product manager doing 4 projects at the same time, yours and 3 others? Or are they dedicated to you and breathing, thinking, leaving your project and doing, the right thing for your company?
Thank you.
I'm going to add just a little bit there. I think, so what you said, Max, you never want to make an outsourced team member feel like they're outsourced, right? It's everybody together. But that kind of division doesn't just happen with outsource. Like I've seen that happen with in-house teams where, there's like a core team and then, the other team, right? So that could happen anywhere. And I think over here in the pants, I guess everybody's wearing pants, but that pants.
Everybody wants to be.
Okay. All right. Max, so why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, because you missed kind of the intros.
Yeah, happy to.
I know it's a little bit late, but like now we have
We'll
some
do
context.
the reverse,
Yeah.
reverse here on my intro. So I'm originally from Costa Rica. I came here for school at MIT, started a company in the marketing automation space. Classic startup, raised capital, went through Techstars, raised more capital, built a team. The better we were doing, the more money we were burning, but we did pretty well and managed to sell the company in 2016 to a very large media company. This is a private equity group that bought a bunch of newspapers, put them together, and then they wanted to sell software to those small business advertisers. I became their CTO. I stayed there for about 3 years and scaled our marketing division to about $100 million in sales. We were a team of probably like 50 or 60 people in product engineering, IT, and systems under my command. Incredible experience going from like resource-constrained startup to this, public company, 10,000 people at the mothership. But then with all the complexities of understanding, legal compliance and just the incentive alignment of having a channel partner in 1,000 salespeople that were selling our product through their channel. Anyways, I left that, took a little bit of time off, and then started Telescope, which is my current company, where we connect remote software engineers in Latin America with companies in the US to provide them with better career opportunities. And again, the main difference is that we become the employer of record running payroll and benefits, but they don't have a career with us, they have a career with you and your startups, and that's the big breakthrough. We've got a pretty active community in Costa Rica where we've got about 250 certified engineers working for us. Timing was very good because we started right before COVID and demand for remote just exploded, so we ran that wave to profitability. And on my spare time, I teach a class at MIT Sloan on go-to-market for startups.
Very cool. I didn't know about the class.
Yeah, it's a little side gig.
Any other questions from anyone?
I have a 1-year-old too, so
Yeah.
go figure.
I wanted to ask you both a question about some of the legal requirements in classifying contractors versus full-time employees. So we talk about, building a shared culture where everybody feels like they're part of the same thing, but there are some distinct things for taxation, for other legal reasons that you cannot treat contractors in certain ways, and how do you handle that? And are there cases where you don't want a contractor because they can't be as part of the team as a full-time employee could be?
I mean, I don't know as much about some ways like the legal side or the HR side. Like I'm aware of some of the things having to deal with it, but I think about more for a culture side. And when your contract workers are not in the U.S. or the same location, it doesn't seem as obvious because you're remote and you're not necessarily taking like the same days off anyway. But when your contractors are all like in the U.S. and you're in the U.S. and like they can't take a day off or their time is different, then it does start to feel pretty different. I don't really have a good answer. Like it is awkward when you're trying to make one team. It's like, oh, well, we're on vacation, but you don't really get vacation, or you got to just get your hours. Like, I don't know if I have a good answer on that, but it can be challenging.
Yeah, so for me, not legal advice, but I think we all generally know the difference between a contractor and a full-time employee in terms of what you can expect from them. Set hours, like you cannot expect, like a contractor, it's like, hey, here's the project, this is what I expect you to do, deliver this thing in the next month, the next 2 weeks. It's a contract that is time constrained versus a full-time. It's like an ongoing relationship at will. Where like, yeah, you're expected to be here at 9 a.m. and check in for a stand-up or whatnot. I do think the lines have blurred a little bit, particularly with remote work and what's happened. And so again, from a legal point of view, I don't have advice. From a reality point of view, I think you can do a lot of things culturally to involve those teams remotely, even if they're contractors, and still have them feel and act as if they were full-time team members. And I would encourage you to do so because I think it's better for both sides.
Yeah, I think a big part of it, outside of, there's going to be differences, just like in the rules, is what does it mean to make them feel like a full team? A lot of it's like that you're listening to them, they're allowed to like give input about ideas, that they're not just sitting there like doing exactly what you say. And that will be better for them, better for you, if like they're encouraging them to be able to be a full part of the design process and figuring out what you're doing and contributions.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to this because I actually know a little bit more about the legal side of it. So, with the contractors, you can't tell them like specifically like where to work, how to work, all that kind of stuff, right? But it comes back to what Jane keeps talking about is culture, right? So like I work with a lot of contractors and on a lot of different like projects and clients and all that kind of stuff. And the companies that we work with, the startups that are excited about, like stand-ups, everybody's excited, everyone feels like part of the team, right? Like everyone feels like they want to contribute, right? So you're not telling a contractor, hey, work overtime, right? You're basically saying like, hey, like we have a release, whatever, tomorrow, right? You can't force them to work, but they're gonna want to because they like the project. Like I've pulled all-nighters with contractors before, not because I had to or they had to, but because we're like, we gotta fix this bug, right? And then if you like on the in-house team, I don't know a single developer that like comes in at 9 a.m. So like full-time in-house, whatever, right? So like just because you can tell them doesn't mean they will, right? So it's all about, it comes down to cohesiveness and culture.
Yeah, we think something that we talked about when we have contractors at other places is how much do you invest in them and how much do you invest in their like learning time? Like especially if it is a hard skill to find or you just have, this is who you have on hand, whether they're full-time or contract, do you pay them to learn a new language if you're gonna move to that new language? Like thinking about that kind of decision, like how much are you gonna invest in, especially if they're junior, coaching and mentoring them? Because like same, and how I was thinking about it is like just the same as my full-time, like, because you're talking about they could leave. Anybody could leave at any time. Contractor, full-time, anybody could leave you at any time. But if you're investing them, if you care about them, if they feel like they're getting more opportunity with you, they're more likely to stay with you. And then you don't have to go find someone else because you're showing that you kind of care about them both as a person and as their contribution to the resource, just as if they were a full-time hire.
Exactly. Like you celebrate their birthdays, you give them an anniversary gift, the whole thing.
It's such a great.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
I've seen it firsthand. Like people with better offers, and just because they love the team that they work with, they love what they're doing, they love the technology and the culture that they've experienced, and they just stay. Like they're happy and they're so bought in that they truly are in it for the greater good and the goal that you're trying to achieve as a company. And if you get to that point, I think you're in really good shape because you're also going to attract the best people, right? Their friends and other friends of friends who they want to pull into the team because I want the best people to be working with me on this very cool thing. So, great points.
Oh, you have a question now. You had your chance. No.
What do you think about hiring somebody overseas as one of the first employees of the company, just in terms of considerations?
Do you know them?
Well, I don't know them yet.
Yeah, if you don't know them, it's a little bit more If you already know them, like wherever they are, like you'd hire them. If you don't know them and you won't have a chance like to spend a lot of time vetting them, it gets a little bit more challenging.
But are you talking about hiring someone directly, but they happen to be overseas?
Yes.
And you met them like how?
Some website, basically.
Found them on Twitter, on X, sorry.
Do you know anyone they know? Can you get a referral? Kind of like you were talking
I mean,
about.
I don't
referrals.
have this person I was considering doing
Yeah.
this. That's why.
I think
Curious to hear your thoughts.
the way I look at it, you're making a bigger decision than you might realize. If you're setting up a team that is going to be fully remote, fully distributed, and you're committed to making that work, and you're going to be async, everything's going to be documented. We're going to have a way of working where everybody can be anywhere in the world, and it's going to be outcomes based. it's a commitment. It's not easy, but it's very doable. There's many large and small companies that make that work, but that's what you're deciding when you say we're going to have that first hire be in Sri Lanka or whatever it may be, right? Because they might be on a time zone where you have like little overlap. You don't want to be at 3 a.m. in the morning. You don't want to be there. Like so I think what you're deciding is a different set of considerations. I'm not as much against it. Obviously, like I live in the remote world. My company is distributed. My team is all over the place. We don't have a centralized office, and so we decided to do that. And I think it can work, but it's a decision on how you want to build your culture and your company.
I have a little bit of a legal bit to this. So, remote founders aren't as incentivized by equity. Because basically, you know, like my sister is a lawyer and she has this quote that she always tells me that a contract is only as strong as your will to uphold it, right? So if someone breaks a contract but no one does anything about it, was there ever really a contract? So I had a situation, for example, where I wanted to have like a co-founder in another country, and I basically told him, like, here, I'll give you like 30% of the company. He's like, I'm not interested because like I trust you and I believe you, but if for some reason down the road, like you don't, I have no recourse, right? And he's kind of right. Like I wouldn't do that, but some people might, right? So at a co-founder level, just make sure that you're aligned in that way.
But just to make the counter argument, it's the same with any co-founder, right? Even if they're in, I don't know, in Nebraska, right? You found them and they're like in the US, and yeah, you're in the same legal system, but you can still like.
No, but in the U.S. you have recourse, right? Like,
No, but you're gonna have a 4-year vesting on or your founder shares, and you have the majority of the company. So if you, for whatever reason, decide they're not the right partner, you could always like do the wrong thing and just say, hey, sorry, but this is not working.
the situation I'm talking about is like literally like you have a contract with someone. You're like, okay, you own 50% of the company, but they're in. So I'm Ukrainian. Let's say Ukraine. They're in Ukraine, right? If you default on that contract, like what are they gonna do? Fly to America and like go to court? They won't. But if they're in Nebraska, they will, right? Or they can. So there are some countries like EU countries, they have some recourse, but some countries you don't. Like South America, like what are you gonna do? Who are you gonna call? Right? Yeah. So that and I'm not saying that as like I'm saying that as someone that like if you're looking for a remote co-founder, make sure that you have full trust in each other. Because it's, I've seen some things out there.
Yeah, so I was thinking about it's like distance, not just in time, but in your network. Like if you're going to start looking outside the U.S. and you're very familiar with U.S. laws, like that's going to be stuff you're going to have to learn about in order to make sure you have a good contract. And do you know anybody in the area? Like going back to like make sure you get referrals. The closer it is to you, either in your network or in your distance where you live or your time zone, it's more likely you're going to have some kind of network associated with that. But the further away they are, whether from like your industry, whether it's distance, it's less likely you have connections, and you're just really trying to build really a trust relationship when you have a huge gap of getting there. So if you can reduce the gap to that trust, like what can you do to make sure that will be more successful in the end?
Yeah.
So just wanted to share an example which along the similar lines that I just experienced recently. So reason I'm here is because I'm also thinking of starting something on my own. Haven't taken concrete steps yet. So I reached out to a friend and he's back in India, and I was like, well, he showed interest in working together with me. So we went through multiple calls, figuring out the business plan. We even make the business plan. And in the end, when we started talking about the ownership of how it would work out, his suggestion was, I don't want to be part of the US company. I will establish a company in India, and that would invest in your US company. So that would be part owner of the US company. I'm wondering, maybe because of legal implications, he wants to protect himself, because if something goes wrong with the company in the US, he doesn't want to be directly responsible. But any thoughts on this sort of a model?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so
Yeah, you need to
I think
ask a
there's
lawyer.
definitely, if you're going to set up a company, you're going to engage a lawyer at some point, and they have the answers, right? There's ways to, partner with anyone, anywhere in the world, and I think it's just a question of what's the best from like a tax exposure point of view, from a personal liability point of view, and there will be answers depending on the geo. I don't know.
Yeah, it might just come down to they need to show proof of employment, and it's like easier to show proof with an Indian company, something like that.
Yeah, and that's why like all of these employer of record type companies exist also, right? Because it's so much easier for both sides to have an intermediary taking care of it.
So I just know how much work it took when I was at big companies with fully staffed HR to manage
Yeah, I know.
employees outside of the US. And then you try to do that as your first thing as a startup. Like that's going to be very, very challenging.
It is.
But I've started companies with like a friend who's abroad, but it was all like, you know, emails of like, okay, like 50-50. It was less legal, but that's because we trust each other, right?
Well, you can put a founder agreement in place, ChatGPT, and it'll
Yeah.
spit out something that is probably like as good as you need to get started.
Yeah.
Do you have a question? I
Any?
feel like you were going to ask a question. No?
No, we're good. Should we do like a closing remark? Max, tell people when they should come to you.
So I think, you know, we're best suited to help a company that has recently received funding. They have a product in place, they have a team in place, whether that's product management, design, or maybe the founder doing those functions, maybe 1 or 2 engineers, but with this new funding, we want to accelerate growth. We got to grow the team from 2 to 5, from 5 to 10. That's the perfect time to engage with us. We'll help you with all the recruiting with no upfront fees. So basically, you get to talk to us. We match you with an engineer. You interview them. If you like them, you make an offer. If you don't, you didn't spend $1. And then once you make the offer, we also forgo all of the recruiting fees in exchange of becoming your payroll and benefits provider. So we're really in it for the long haul. I've been in startups all my life, and I know how, you know, to make this incentive alignment to make sure that we're in it together, and your success is my success. Would love to help you if you're looking to grow your teams.
And Jane, when should people come to you?
So I like to talk about kind of the early stage, but your question about how do you know product market fit, I love to chat about that and what are some ways to get there without building code. So happy to chat with people about that.
Awesome. And then for me, if you're building anything, we work with startups. We work with hundreds of startups. We set you up with a CTO, like a real fancy CTO that's like $1 million a year CTO, but in a nonprofit sort of way. But we also help with engineering. Our mission and model is nonprofit. So basically, when we accidentally make money, we have an angel fund. We put it in there, and we reinvest back into startups. So fast CTO, telescoped, and well.
And we are
GSK,
hiring
I
at
guess.
GSK. We have
Oh, there we
Onyx
go.
is a growing team. If anyone is like machine learning, engineers, DevOps, cloud for the Onyx, and we have an office in Boston.
How do you
That's
think
awesome.
about? I was kidding.
Any final questions? I think we're done.
If there's a final question, we have time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe more specific to you is, so you're actually using resources from Costa Rica to here, right? So when you started your company, did you actually go through like funding rounds, or did you just bootstrap it to get going? 'Cause I'm also thinking of a model where I'll have resources overseas, and so just trying to understand from an investor point of view, like what kind of battles or hurdles you faced actually.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, my first company, we went through funding rounds, you know, angels, early stage VCs. Like we did the venture route. This time around, we were actually going to bootstrap, but some of our investors from the last company insisted on giving us money, and we didn't want to turn money away. We didn't use most of that money because the model was from the beginning, you know, thought out to be something we could bootstrap. So we quickly became profitable. Again, a little bit lucky with timing on COVID and the adoption of remote. But we did do a small seed round, and nothing since. Yeah, taking advantage of the cost differential as well has been very helpful, obviously.
I've never had any fight from an angel or a VC about an like an offshore team, except for when there's HIPAA. So HIPAA is like its own little thing, and so but SOC 2 is fine, ISO is fine, PCI is fine. HIPAA is the only weird one.
I think, sorry, I should have clarified. I also meant like, even if your idea is to start overseas, you know, the U.S. investors get involved in that, or is that a bit of a hurdle there?
I think they love it, actually,
Yeah.
because you're going to be more efficient with your capital.
It's the norm. Like in 2024, it's almost expected that you have a distributed team. Maybe 15 years ago, it would have been like, I don't understand, but now it's fine.
All right, thank you so much to the panel, and thank you all for coming. We have a lot more in store today and for the rest of the week. Tonight is the keynote with Yvonne Howe, Secretary of Economic Development, and Boston Globe's Scott Kirshner. That'll be here at 6 p.m. And then in this room specifically, the next session is You Got It, Fostering Collaboration and Efficiency in DevOps. So stick around if that interests you. If not, you can go outside and find what else we have going on. And if you're joining us virtually, just hang tight. We'll start the next session in a few minutes. And lastly, the photographer here, Kevin, from Three Circle Studio, is going to be around for the rest of the week, and he's doing headshots in the morning, so definitely take advantage of that. And that's it, so thank you.